Awesome. Well, we'll get started here. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We're excited to have you here for our first session on the board development workshop series led by Kim Box. We're in good hands here today. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, my name's Cameron Law, and I serve as the executive director of the Carlsen Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and we serve as a regional hub and platform for providing approachable and accessible entrepreneurial education, community, and support to enable startup founders of all backgrounds to ultimately scale and launch their businesses. And we're excited to run these types of workshop series to support you as founders or people that are supporting founders in getting the tools, frameworks, and mindsets that will set you up for success. And so we're excited about this three-part series. So today is session number 1. And we're going to be in good hands over this three-part series. We have Kim Box, who's one of our advisory board members, but she also is an independent director on the board of McGrath Rent Corp. She also served for 9 years as an independent director for the American River Bank Board, and now serves on the board of Applied Science, a private med tech company. She has significant board and executive leadership experience ranging from information technologies to M&A and global operations, amongst many other things. And Kim also holds an NACD directorship certification and a cert in cybersecurity oversight from Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon. And this last year, she was named to the NACD Directorship 100, which is an awesome recognition for leading corporate directors. So we're going to be in good hands throughout this three-part series. And I know her most proudest of all of those is serving on the Carlsen Center Advisory Board. And so we're excited to have her support here at the center, and then also just supporting many amazing founders. And she's done some great work with our Fourth Wave program as a mentor, and been a part of that as well through her leadership at Gatekeeper as well. So I'll turn it over to Kim to take it away from here. Feel free to use the chat feature if you do have any questions or comments as we go. We'll be engaging in that, and feel free to also use that raised hand feature if you want to bring any questions in. I'll help curate that for Kim as we go. But thank you all for being here, and take it away, Kim.
Okay, thanks, Cameron. And I am going to go through some slides to use as a backdrop for this program. And if anyone has any questions, I guess ask along the way, and I'll make sure we leave a few minutes at the end also for questions. But this is a enjoyable thing for me to do. I've been serving on boards. I was thinking the other day, I sat down and counted how many boards I've been on, and it's well over a dozen boards. Started out with nonprofit, moving into public boards and advisory boards and startup boards, and now public boards as well for the last decade. So it's something that's really near and dear to my heart in terms of responsibility and what we need to do. So here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to go over what does it mean to be on a board, what's the purpose and structure, a little bit about the composition at different stages of the company. We'll discuss a little bit about the board versus the advisory board, and then things to think about when you're recruiting a board, and then I'll summarize with the last slide here. So, I think a lot of folks, when they start a company, the board of directors is not top of the list. I mean, I just know that you start forming the company, maybe not even as a corporation at the beginning, and then you realize you're at a point where you need to have a corporate structure. And then you start finding out about some of the responsibilities. So there's two main things that you're responsible, and it's duty of care and duty of loyalty. And duty of care is that you're always going to act in good faith, what's best for the company, and be prepared and engaged to make decisions based on information that you have. And also, you have to take minutes when you meet as a board and make sure that you're doing that duty of care. And then the second thing is duty of loyalty. You must be loyal to the company and its shareholders and act in their best interest. And you must not act in your own self-interest. Now, this feels a little bit like, well, when you start the company, you're the company, usually there's one person, maybe a couple people. And you probably think of it more along the lines of acting in the best the technology, or, you know, what you're trying to do, or the mission and all these things. But when you get to the point where you actually create a corporation, you're really bound to the corporation is not owned by a person. It's its own thing, you know, and you have to be acting in good faith for the company at all times. This becomes very serious when you have investors, and we're going to kind of look at that as the company moves along. You know, acting in the best, you know, in good faith for the investors, and making decisions that are best for them, not necessarily best for the founder personally. And I think this is a nuance that is sometimes a little bit difficult as the company moves forward. But anyways, just things to take into consideration. So what does it look like? So basically, a board of directors is to provide the responsibility to provide oversight, make sure that there's a return on shareholder value. So you have articles of incorporation, you know, basic stuff. I don't know how far along everyone on the phone is. I'm sorry, on the Zoom is, but I did go look at a few, and I know a few of you on here have probably formed several companies. So you know that there's the articles of incorporation. You know, you have to say where the business is, what's the purpose, establish number of shares, and then incorporate who are the incorporators and who are the initial officers. The second part is the bylaws. And this is a statement of things that really are the laws of the company. What's the purpose? You set the number of directors. So many times the minimum is 2. So you have to have yourself and one other person. If you're a C Corp, certainly, and different structures. There's also, you establish the shareholder meetings. How many meetings are you going to have a year? Like there's a minimum usually of 1 shareholder meeting. And then several board of director meetings. Then there's also committees if you choose to have them, and officers of the company. And then there's indemnification amendment of the bylaws. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to pretend to play one here. So if you ask me really technical questions about, you know, specifics on this, you know, I'd have to give you my own knowledge and experience, but most people at this point have a legal counsel to go into the details of how they want to set these things, like the number of shares and so on. But one thing I will also say is that if you're being asked to be on a board of directors, when someone asks me if I want to join a board, there's a lot of reasons why I would join a board. But one of the things I always do is asked to look at the bylaws, because the bylaws establishes who has the power. And some people change the bylaws to say that the chair of the board has complete voting rights, or not voting rights, but, you know, the right to veto things, and sometimes it's more evened out. And so looking at the bylaws is really important. There are boilerplates. You can obviously get off the internet to kind of see what they look like and so on. But understanding the bylaws, last time I did this session, somebody from the session contacted me afterwards and said that they went back and looked at their bylaws, and it said that they had to have 3 directors and they only had 2, and they didn't know that was in the bylaws. They just, you know, everybody's busy, they didn't look. So if you do have a company already and you haven't really read your bylaws, I really highly recommend that you get familiar with them. And then the third thing is shareholder rights. So voting power, ownership, right to transfer ownership, dividends, right to inspect the corporate documents, right, they have a right to sue for wrongful acts. That last little bullet there, the right to sue for wrongful acts, goes back to the first slide, which is the duty of care and duty of loyalty. If you're not acting in the best interest of the corporation and the shareholders, then you can get in some sticky situations. So that's kind of the shareholders' rights. And shareholders come into play beyond the founders, is, you know, when you start having outside investors and that type of thing. So I'm going through this because I don't want to belabor something that people are familiar with, but it is really important. And I'll keep kind of threading some of this through as we move through the set of information here. But I guess you can raise your hand. Cameron, let me know if there's any questions in the chat, because I'm not looking at the chat. So you can ask questions in the chat, or you can, comment.
Yep. So we do have a raised hand. So Shirley, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, it's really quick. I wanted to put it on chat, but I kept redoing it. When board members sign on to be a board member, do they have to each sign a document, to hold them accountable if they're not, to make sure that they are acting with the duty of care? What kind of accountability is there for board members when they join?
Well, by being voted onto the board, you are automatically responsible for these things that I'm showing you. I've been on several boards and I've never had to sign a form that says, here are your responsibilities and that you have duty of care and duty of fiduciary responsibility. Those are established as part of the corporation. So I think the part that might be interesting is if there's certain bylaws and you haven't reviewed them with the board of directors and they don't understand those nuances, that would be, I don't know who that would be kind of naive on the part of the director. But honestly, I think a lot of people join boards and don't understand any of this. They don't understand that they have a responsibility, that it's way beyond their own personal interest. It has to go beyond. So yeah, there's not a form necessarily. I have joined nonprofit boards where they had a list of expectations and usually involved annual donation and things like that. And they would show me and say, if you agree to these, then we'd like you to join the board, or some sort of dialogue. But I've never had to actually sign a form because once you get on the board, like if it's incorporated in California, you are held to these laws. So
thank you. I'm very new to this stuff.
No, it's a good question. And I think a lot of people joining boards at early stages, a lot of people get their family members on board or somebody they trust, which is highly recommended. You want people you trust and whatnot. But over time, things get shift and change, especially when you have actual investors putting money in the company. But no, it's a good question because a lot of people don't understand how this stuff works. So that's why we're here, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I mean, when people incorporate, there's all kinds of documents that you sign as the owner of the person starting the company, and it's a lot of legal terms, but it's important to understand what that means. You can run a company without having it be incorporated at first. A lot of people do that as a founder, but there's a point in time where you really have to kind of either become an LLC or something to get the right structure and the right financials set up and how you want to do it to protect yourself. But honestly, that's a whole nother conversation. Okay.
We have one more question, and then we'll move on to this next slide. So go ahead.
Okay.
Is that me, Ziad?
Yep. Yeah. Go ahead, Ziad.
Hi. I was gonna ask about like if you form a company, an S corporation, and then let's say a few years down the road you have a good employee and you want to make them part of ownership, like make them an owner or business partner or shareholder or whatever the right term is. How difficult and what does that entail? Like how does that work if you want to get somebody on board like a few years down the road after the company's actually making generating revenue and all that good stuff?
So you're not talking about bringing them on as a board of directors, you're talking about an employee?
Yeah, so an employee and then making them like an owner, making them like a shareholder or.
Yeah, well, I will give you kind of a general idea. First of all, it's very easy to do that. It depends on how you've structured the company. If it's an LLC, there's different formats. Like you can have a single member LLC, or you can have a multiple member, and then you can document how many shares you're giving them and who's giving up shares. Like if you're 100% owner, I know this because I was involved in asking to be a part of an LLC as a co-owner, and the attorneys worked up the paperwork to say that I would have 25% and the other person would be 75%, and then we established that as part of the record of the company. If it's a C corp and you have a capitalization table and a set of stock, then you can decide to issue certain shares to that person. And when you have a company, there's a certain amount of stock, and in order to give someone stock, unless you have a stock pool, I mean, this is a whole I think this is a whole nother conversation of how that works. There's just so many different ways to do it, but very common. People start companies and they start bringing employees on. And if it's early stage, I had a company that I started and ran that everybody worked on equity for, multiple years because they could. It was something we were doing on the side. So you can do it like that. And you just have there's lots of different, forms. Either you can have an advisory form that says they get X amount of stock, or you can have a stock option plan that the company's created. So hopefully that gives you a general idea. And,
Okay,
and,
cool. Yeah,
and
so they would get
even-
shares.
what's that?
So they would basically be, they would get shares, basically. Is that like your?
Well, if you could hire someone and pay them money if your company has funding and revenue and whatnot, or you can hire them, and if they've agreed to it, if you can get someone to agree to come on for equity, that's a way you can do it with shares. It's a longer conversation because there's a lot of different ways that it can happen, but it's very common. Let me just say that.
Okay.
And I'm sure that Cameron probably has another program that goes through a lot of that detail of how to shift equity and manage a cap table and all of that once you get going.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. So anyways, and I think what you were asking was more around the employee versus this is really talking about the board of directors, which provides oversight of the company. So I want to kind of go through a little bit of what is, different stages and what the board looks like. So when you first start your company, even pre-seed, before even seed funding, it's usually just the founders, right? And maybe the CEO if that person's different than the founders. And then it moves on to getting seed funding. So then, you have the founders, you have the CEO. And by the way, this is all my experience and things that I've been exposed to. I'm sure there's people on the phone or on the Zoom here that would say, I've seen it happen different. I've seen less people. I've seen more people. This is just a general idea to give you a broad brush of how it could work. There could be many different ways people do things. I've seen people build boards that look more like an advisory board to me. But what I will say is at every stage of the company, you want to be really careful about who you put on the board. Very hard to get people off the board once you got them on the board, whether it's because of the just the difficulty of the conversation and how to explain why you wanted them on and now you want them off, or whether it's just the person isn't going to easily go. So you want to make sure in your bylaws you have easy ways to manage that as well. So then once you start growing and maybe you get some investors, small investors at the beginning, your board could grow a little bit. And we're going to talk about advisory because I think sometimes people populate their board with some people that would be better suited as advisors. I just think that the seats are very coveted and they need to be carefully managed. You don't want like some huge board that makes it difficult to make decisions or even have a conversation to get things done. Then when you get towards the Series A, then you're having, possible, venture capital investing in the firm. They're going to require seats on the board, and it could be 1, 2. They could require an independent director. So an independent director is someone who doesn't have like a large investment, or they're not the founder with a large amount of stock. There's somebody. So I serve as an independent director, and I've done it on several boards in advisory areas. So that makes them a little bit less. They're more impartial to look at the business and help see what needs to happen, and not have decisions being made affect them personally. So anyway, so the VC firm will put somebody on, depending on how big the firm is. They have different ways that they do that. Might be multiple people if you have multiple investors. They might come on as an as an observer. One of the companies that I was CEO of, we had an investor who wanted to be involved on the board but didn't want to be directly on the board. So he was an observer. He acted as if he was on the board, but he couldn't make decisions or vote on things. So it kept him a little bit of an arm's length away. The next area would be possibly an acquisition. So if your company gets acquired by a private equity firm, then they're going to rework the way that the board is done. And they usually put their own people, keep some people that might have been involved, the CEO or founder, and they might put some independent directors Some of the really large PE firms usually put, what I've been learning about is two independent directors, but this is large size companies. There's so many permutations of this. So this is just giving you a general idea. And then when a company goes IPO, they become a public company. There's usually 7 to 9. It can be more, not typically too much less, but it can be more. The CEO is typically on the board. There's industry experts and independent directors. It's required as a public company by SEC rules, along with many, many other rules that you don't have to abide by as a younger company before someone goes public. But it's required that they have independent directors. It's required that you have certain committees. There's just a whole bunch of, it's an exciting time to be a public company once you go that route and can raise capital in those markets. But it does come with a lot of requirements on the board of directors and the company. So anyway, so again, this is just a general, early on, it's the founder. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes if the CEO is different than the founder, typically the CEO is on the board. Sometimes the chairman and the CEO are one and the same. Sometimes they're separate. Kind of helps to have them be separate because you get a little bit more balance, but it's many different ways. So anyway, so this kind of gives you an idea there. I'm going to keep going unless Rich tells me there's.
We have a couple questions. So the first one is maybe speaking to the question was, do the board members get paid? And so maybe at what stage do you start paying board members, if at all? So that'll be the first question.
So if it's a really early stage company, the pay would be in equity. So you'd give them a certain amount of equity each year to be on the board. I've personally not seen people pay cash for a board seat in an early stage company or a growth company, possibly not even a Series A, B, C private company. When the company gets acquired by a private equity firm, if it's a very large private equity firm, they do pay a retainer plus stock options. So it's typically stock options for the first 3 levels of this, and then after IPO, the directors, it's varied, and I can give you an idea if you want, but there's usually a cash retainer plus stock every year. So I mean, on the public boards, there's definitely pay, and it's not typical that it wouldn't be a cash plus equity. Depends on the size of the company and how it's structured. And when it's in the public company, they typically pay what's called RSU, restricted stock. So it's actual stock. It's not stock options that you have to buy at a later time. So it's taxed just like cash. So it's some combination of those two.
Awesome. All right. The next question is, what is the difference between an independent director and advisory board? Is it voting rights?
Well, an independent director just means that the person doesn't have a vested stake, like they're not a majority owner or don't work for the company. If somebody is on the board, a lot of times you'll see the CEO and the COO on the board, but they're not independent. So there's actual conversations they cannot be involved in a public company, at least in the private company. Like as your company starts to grow, it's just good governance to have somebody that's outsider that can come in and kind of give you this. It's hard, you see all the things you're doing, you're growing, you're doing all kinds of technology. Having an outsider come in and be able to look through how the company's doing and give advice, especially in certain areas. Like I worked for HP for 30 years and I ran $1 billion global business, and it was a lot of operational efficiencies, all kinds of global considerations. So I'm an independent director that goes on a board that can say, okay, so you want to scale. Let's talk about what does that mean to fast scaling of people? Will your manufacturing take it? So anyways, that's just an example of an independent director. So at the early stages, you don't really hear too much about independent directors being on the board. And then as far as independent and the advisory board, it's all independent. They're not making any decisions for the company. They're there to give advice. And we're going to go over that in the next slide. So I'll cover that a little bit more.
Awesome. And the last question, and then we'll transition to that next portion, was, do the other board members have a say in who joins the board, and maybe what's that process look like?
It's really interesting. A board kind of takes on its own personality along with the company. And if it's a really well-run board with a company that's collaborative, then the best governance would be that the board meets and everybody discusses what do we need for, what would be the biggest value to bring to our board? Do we need somebody with similar technology or someone that scaled this type of business? Do we need somebody with connections for funding? And you would go through all that and decide what you need. And then you go through the second phase of that. Well, how can we go find those people? Is it through like people like Cameron, who have a lot of outreach for folks that that can help us find those people? Are there people in our own networks? At a young company, you would do that through your own means. In a large company that's public, they would possibly use a search firm, but not always. But also what you see is a founder just goes out and finds people and brings them on board. And, so there's no like law, if you will, that there has to be a collaborative board, but that's what I would suggest, that the board comes together. On a larger company board, you'll have possibly a nomination and governance committee that looks at this holistically every year and says, what do we need on the board? What's going on? How do we, do the best we can for the company? But on a smaller company, it's really going to depend a lot on the founders and the CEO to build the board and work together on that. But I've seen all kinds of behaviors that don't mimic that. So if someone on the Zoom here has seen other behaviors, I wouldn't be surprised, because there's a lot of things that happen in the startup world that either happens because people don't know or because they want to own it and do it the way they want it. But there's also a lot of things that can really be well run in a way that's collaborative and makes sense. And hopefully that's more the norm. Okay. So I'm going to just go over a little bit about the board versus the advisory board versus the actual board of the company. So like I said, the role of the board is they have fiduciary responsibility. They do oversight and they do governance of what's happening with the company. I mean, it's serious business. They have to look at the financials regularly and say, is everything on the up and up? Are we losing money? Are we making money? Where's the money coming from? Can we pay our people? I mean, it's all that type of stuff. And, obviously you want them to really be committed to what's happening with the company, the time that needs to be taken. A very typical thing is a quarterly meeting, plus maybe a strategic meeting. I've gotten involved in companies that didn't have regular meetings, which I'm a structure person, so I always make sure. If you have a company that's been around for, let's just say 2 or 3 years, and you're doing all your stuff and growing and whatnot, and then you decide to get investment, one of the due diligence things is to look at past board meetings, the minutes. So if you haven't had any minutes, then it's like, okay, the group is flying by the seat of their pants. They're not having, regular, governance of what's going on. So there's just some things you want to have. But anyways, so the board is not responsible for getting involved in running the company. I think in the startup world, you see it blend a little bit more, because a lot of times you bring people on that are really going to help, and they might roll up their sleeves and help in a more detailed way, but that's not typically the role of the board. And their role is to do oversight and, obviously assist. But unless they're one of the people in the company, like the CEO and the COO, they're actually running the company. That's not the role. A lot of times they'll have an entrepreneurial background. They are really, really held to confidentiality. That can really damage a company if you have a board of directors that's not confidential and things get out that are sensitive, even financials. I mean, that's, unless you're a public company, you have to publish that stuff. It's not something that you really want to have out on the airways, if you will. Also, you want a board that, is willing to speak up in a productive way and have the discussion and get things done. And it's very strategically focused on the business to look at, where the business is going, where it's been, what can you do to raise the value of the company and get to its goals and make things happen. So, the overall responsibility of the board is to the shareholders. I think that gets lost sometimes, even in every company, public companies or whatever. But really, the company's overall responsibility is in maintaining the shareholder value and looking at, what are we going to do to make sure that the decisions we make and the oversight we do, that we're supporting the team and the team can make the best decisions to increase the value of the company and the shareholders. So on the advisory board side is really, like it says here, its role as advisor, coach, connector. And, they also obviously need to have passion and commitment to the company. But this advisory board, and I've seen it happen different ways. Like I've seen people create advisory positions where they might have 10 advisors and they call them when they need them. And I have advisory board documents, contracts, if you will, where they get a certain amount of equity. And then in the document, it states things like confidentiality and this type of stuff, but also that they're expected to meet with them like 3 times, minimum of 3 times. But typically, you meet with your advisors when you need them. There's other groups that do it really well. I'm on an advisory board right now that meets once a month, and it's an amazing group of about 15 people, and typically about 8 or 10 show up, maybe less sometimes, depending. So, and the CEO brings challenge. He brings an update, and then he brings challenges as to what he needs from the advisors. And the advisors are really varied. I mean, people that are government, tied to the government for this particular company, that's important. Also people that have deep connections in the sales channels, other people that have, really good operational scaling responsibilities, other people that have, done different things that apply. So it's really fun because you get to hear from people that are different industries, different roles. But it really works well. So it's really, again, it can be whenever they need you to a structured meeting. I'm always amazed that the CEO gets everyone to meet once a month, because that's a lot, and again, not everybody can come every time. The other thing about the advisory board is, especially in this particular venue in terms of startup companies, is that they're willing to make introductions, not just for fundraising when the time comes, but also for things like getting into, like the company I was running, we were getting into, CVS and Rite Aid and all this, to have connections for those sales channels, or have connections for other things that you need. So if someone just wants to talk on the advisory meeting, but doesn't want to actually use their network and their connections to help, they wouldn't probably be the best person to have there. Again, upholding confidentiality. You might be less likely to share a lot of detail with an advisory board because it's not tied to the same responsibilities as the board, but still there might be things that are confidential. You want people that are in the industry and really valued for the type of expertise. Also be available for ad hoc sessions for insights, especially if you're not meeting regularly, and then willing to coach and mentor the founder and CEO. There's just all kinds of ways an advisory board member can be useful. I've mentored quite a few people, and every once in a while they'll ask me, would you be willing to be an advisor? I'm like, yeah. They put me on the slide and that's the last I hear from them. So, advisors aren't going to chase you down. You need to engage them. And if you can do it in a way that it has a little bit of structure to it, it can go a much longer way. But they're very different than the board. The board has a lot of responsibilities. It's funny, people will get asked to join a board and they're like, oh, I'm going to be on this board. It's like, you're responsible for that company. I mean, it's not some light thing to take lightly. The other thing, and I don't think I have this in, because it might be in the next session, but when you have a board and you have a company, you need to have what's called D&O insurance, directors and officers. And even if you're small, I would never join a board that didn't have D&O insurance, even if the company wasn't making any money. I just wouldn't, because you can be sued, you can be held responsible. So if you're a CEO and a startup founder, you need to really consider that. And there's a lot of people that can do the D&O insurance has gotten really expensive on public companies because the stakes are super high and in many different ways. But there's different ways to do it on a smaller scale. So anyways, that's another difference. you don't need D&O insurance if you're going on an advisory board. You're not held liable to what's going on with that company like you are as a board member. So anyways, I think we're doing pretty good for time, but I'm going to pause for a second, Cameron.
Yep, we got a couple questions, and then I wanted to make just one comment. I've seen many a times the pictures of people as advisors. Just be careful if you're an entrepreneur and throwing that out there, and someone might know the person and be like, hey, when's the last time you talked to Jeff? I know Jeff really well, right? And it was like, oh, actually, I haven't chatted with him in over a year, right? And so it kind of discredits the whole purpose of you putting that advisor on there. And so really having that representative of people who actually are helping you move that forward or are engaging your work as an advisor. So just wanted to plug that in there. But we do have a question here. This was from Jeff. Are there any things for founders to consider as conflicts of interest for individuals they may want to participate as board member or an advisory board member? So any kind of practices to implement?
Actually, that's a really good question. And you would hope that the person you're pursuing would be forthcoming with whatever the conflict might be. But if you find someone like, you're doing some technology that a lot of people are pursuing and maybe in different ways, and you find someone that has a lot of experience there, but they might still have a big stake in another company, and you try to recruit them as a board member, that would be a conflict of interest. And so I think that should be considered totally. It's a really good question, a really good thing to bring up. So yeah, I mean, hopefully the person that like you pursued somebody unknowingly that they had a stake in something, because people have stakes in a lot of stuff that you don't know. Some of them have stakes in a fund that they're invested in. And then you might come at them at a different angle, and they might be invested in a fund that's invested in a competitive technology or whatever the company's doing. So yeah, I think that's important. I think it has to be both sides, though. I think you have to have a conversation about what you're trying to do, and making sure that that person doesn't have any conflicts, because it might not be obvious. That's a good catch, actually. I don't know if there's a follow-on question to that, but I think that's a really good thing to point out.
There's just one suggestion, was having some sort of policy outlined and developing, getting them to sign on to that, which is maybe more formal than just having the conversation. But
well, if you have an advisor, they're going to sign an advisory agreement that has information in it about not competing, not sharing competitive information, and it has like an NDA kind of built into it. At least if you have one, that's what I had when I've done this. And then the same thing when you sign on with stock options. But no, it's a good question. It's a good thing to offer up.
Yep. So, and we have two more questions. So, any tips on how to transition a board member into an advisory board member role? For example, board governance end of the year assessment finds them to be fit better as an advisory board member and strategic plan for the company.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really mature of a company to do that, first of all, especially at the early stage. You see that in larger companies where they do a board assessment, and even in other companies, it's challenging to get somebody off the board once they're on. But I don't know if the question, because if someone's done an assessment and they realize that and it's a professionally done, the assessment, and the board talks about, we're doing an assessment, we're going to refresh our board. That's the kind of conversations you want to have before it happens. And then when it happens, someone might have for instance, I've been on boards that I just go, this next stage is not I don't have as much to offer on that, in terms of a young company. And I've gone from advisory or board to advisory board because it just made more sense. But having the conversation, just being really open about it, and saying, look, we've done this assessment. Here's where we're at the company. Here's your skills. We'd like to move you over to advisory board. So that sometimes can be very tricky. It depends on the person, actually, how difficult that could be.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I know sometimes just even having the conversation, sometimes the board members wants an out as well, but they just haven't ever been asked. Sometimes they continue to stay on just because they think that that's the best thing for the company, even though sometimes just
Yeah.
having that conversation and being asked. So we have one more question, then we'll move on. So are board members always public? What if a startup wants to stay in stealth mode and not have other people in the market know who's advising them?
Well, if it's a private company, you have a lot of leeway to stay really secretive. It's although if you've incorporated, that's a public record, so people can find that. But you're not required like a public company and other types of scenarios where you have to publish an annual report and things like that. That's published. So, yeah, you can keep it private.
Perfect. I think we're all set here.
Excuse me. Okay. So this is the last slide before I start wrapping up. Pardon me. So basically the board recruitment, and it actually kind of ties into what we were just talking about, the board versus the advisory board and things to consider. So obviously you want a good cultural fit for the company, someone that you enjoy working with. You don't want people on the board that you don't get along with or you think will be difficult in some way to work with. You can't always get people that are experienced board members. I think a lot of times in the early startup days, people that they're learning and they're getting more experience. But if you can find someone that has a little bit of board experience, that would be really, really wonderful. Also very credible and successful in the area of your endeavor. It might not be, I think in the early startup, you're not going to populate your board with, just general people, generally smart business people. You're really going to put people on the board that are in the area that you're developing. You're going to want somebody that can bring some knowledge directly to your mission. And then again, you don't always need someone at the beginning, but if it's just one person, it's hard to have someone, it's good to have somebody bounce ideas. Now, if you're incorporated, then you'll probably have to there's a minimum of 2 board members and sometimes more depending on the bylaws. Keep the board small, use the advisory board. I've mentioned this a few times. Big boards are difficult. You get too many people on the board. There's just too many. Well, first of all, you got to arrange everybody's calendar, but it's also harder to make decisions. You want to move fast when you're at the early stages. And then I know that a lot of times you have to have at least 2 board members. And that's why if you look at the bylaws, if you have just 2 board members, there's someone that has a little bit more voting power than the other, so that if it has to be a tie broken, someone will override the other one, usually the founder or the chair or something like that. But it is a good practice to have odd numbers. And this comes into play with how you do the voting and making sure that you're not having a tie. This is super common in all the boards I've been on. We always keep it at 7 or 9 or 5, something like that. And then building diversity as you build the board. I think it's difficult when you're really small, but as you're building the board, make sure you don't get people that all think the same way as you do. I mean, having people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different, cultural things, it really helps bring about questions and oversight that you wouldn't otherwise get if everybody on the board is exactly like yourself. I feel very strongly about that. It's even different personalities, it's just it really helps build a really strong board. And then at different stages require different directors. I don't have like a slide on this, but I did on the various ones of, early stage, seed and all that. So those are different stages, but there's also just different stages of the company's evolution and what you need as you're going through each of those stages. And I love that question earlier about how you can move somebody from the board to the advisory board, because it is difficult. So you want to make that part of your culture, that you're always innovating, even on how you do your board. When someone invests, though, they start getting a real stronghold in there. So you really want to make sure that, and sometimes you don't have a choice of who's on your board. If you have an investment from venture capital, they'll probably put somebody there that they want to put on there that they feel is the right oversight. So early days, you have a lot of flexibility, and then it gets less control starts happening as you get bigger and more things happening. But it's happening because you've been building a strong business with growth and and running well-run company and innovation. So on the advisory board side, again, different role as an advisor, coach. You still want somebody that's a good cultural fit, but probably not as strongly as it is on the board side. It's you're meeting less frequently in different type of scenarios. You want someone that's going to add good value to your mission, your strategies, that has something to offer. Also, the connections are really important, and that they're willing to make them. A lot of people have connections, they're not willing to make those introductions. I've seen it many times, but having someone that says that they want to be a part of it and they want to help and actually, get you in front of the right people is really, really key. And then look for diverse backgrounds and experiences. I mentioned this in the board side too, but on the advisory board, you're gonna have a lot more people, and you want to be able to really look at different angles of the mission that you have, whether it's how do they know about marketing in my space? Is this person more of a tech person that I need? Is this person more of a sales and or product development or whatever it is? So that's really good. And it also, you can also have people that will help with attracting investors. So like I said, asking someone, putting them on a slide is pretty weak. And I'm really glad that Cameron pointed that out. If you're going to put somebody on a slide, you better be engaging them in some sort of regularity. And then also someone who's had success in the industry, obviously. And then people who you want to learn from, people that you respect and you think, I have a lot to learn from this person, because if you're open to insights and learning, then that's wonderful. And then you'll have people surrounding you that can help with you with your journey and also your own personal growth. So I'm gonna pause there for a second. Cameron, if there's nothing, not any questions at this point, I'm gonna go to the kind of wrap up.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm not seeing any, but we can give a second, and maybe as you transition, if there's anyone who has a question, feel free to use the raise hand feature, and if not, we'll conclude with some parting thoughts.
So, I have been talking about all these areas, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I put this D&O insurance at the top because it is really important, especially if someone's asking you to be on a board. It is serious business. You are held liable to what's happening with the company. Again, I just mentioned building diversity in your boards, really important. It's really hard when you're really small and there's only 2 or 3 of you. But if you can consider it through the journey of the company, it will make for a stronger group of board members. And also cultural fit. You want somebody who believes in the values of what you're doing. I think that's really important. Again, as you get bigger and you get a bit more investors, and may not always have the best power over that nuance, but if you can, it's important. And then surround yourself with innovative, high integrity people. I didn't talk a lot about integrity, but hopefully you've gotten the feel for it in terms of being responsible for the company and the fiduciary responsibility, and that people that will take that seriously and know that they're on the board and that they're being held accountable to the shareholder value. Also spend time with your board on strategic discussions. I think a lot of times people just want to check the box that they had the board meeting, they kept the board informed. But the board's there also to help with what you're doing, and you should be able to have strategic conversations. And yeah, you want to give them the nuts and bolts of what's going on with the financials and any other challenges or great things happening, but set aside time to talk about your strategies and where you could use their help, and ask for what you need. Get the board engaged earlier rather than later. And if someone's not working out, address it as quickly as you can. It's not easy. I will say that right off the bat. It's very difficult when you want to get somebody off of a board. And sometimes when the company's younger, it's people really well. But it is the right thing to do when you get things addressed quickly. It's always less painful in the long run. And then be mindful of how you're building the board. I think even coming to this session and hearing some of these ideas around building a board, and hearing the questions, asking questions, find people that you can keep asking the questions so that when you're building your board, you can do it in a way that is best for the company and eventually the shareholders that you're returning the value to. Okay, I'm going to pause there because we have another 5 to 7 minutes, and that way we can either have a dialogue or people can ask questions.
We had two additional questions come in, and one, actually three, but one I'll answer. Yes, we will share a copy of the slides, and then you'll have access to the recording as well. So that will be sent a little bit later. In terms of the questions for you, Kim, is it common to have term limits for your board members? And if so, what's common practice? 2 years, 3 years, etc.
There's always usually term limits in the bylaws, and then you revote the directors in each year. I've seen it be open-ended also. They just get on, and although if you have, so in a public company, you get voted every year during the annual shareholder meeting, and you know, there's a lot of people that own your stock because it's in the public markets, and they get to vote also. But when it's smaller, it's, you know, it's the folks on the board, and they can bring it up annually. You can do a 2-year term, 3-year term. I have not seen much more than a 3-year term.
I'll ask one, and then we'll go to Scott. So this question is, are there platforms that can help you connect with people looking to join a board, or do you know any good channels to identify potential people interested in joining boards?
I want to know from the person that asked that, are you talking about early stage or late stage or just anything? Because there's a ton of things I could suggest depending on what you're looking. Early stage.
Early stage. Yeah.
Okay. You know, I don't know of a platform for early stage. I'm sure there is, maybe Gust or one of those systems that people put their information on and you can go peruse it. So I don't know. I don't know how you know, building a network here in our community is really important. You can go to all kinds of places like A Million Cups and, you know, the stuff that Cameron's working on, and get involved in the ecosystem and keep an eye out. I always tell people, if you're interested in being on a board, the first thing you need to do is tell people you're interested in being on a board, because if nobody knows, then you're never going to know, because it's not the same as a job opening. You don't go post a board opening. It just doesn't happen. That's not how it works. It's a much more closed situation, because it's so different. You know, it's a different kind of oversight, and it's very specific. So I don't have a good answer in terms of you know, early stage. Maybe the best answer is building a community in the ecosystem here and going to all kinds of startup type of environments and making it clear that you're interested. If you know some of the seed funding groups around town, I would if you have connections there, maybe you could let them know you're interested. I mean, you have to have a skill that someone's looking for, so you have to kind of triangulate with that as well.
Yeah, I think I would echo 1 Million Cups. That's a really great resource. And a lot of times as an entrepreneur, you know, as you present, is I'm looking for an advisor with this kind of experience or expertise, and that will help you navigate that more quickly, or that person might be in the space as well. So yeah. I think that would be good. So Scott, you had your hand raised.
Yes, Cameron, Kim, thank you for having this. I really appreciate it. I find a tremendous amount of value from these moments. We just finished up a round of fundraising, and we're going into a much larger round of fundraising. And our CFO has said, okay, so if we go here, this person may want a board seat, and this person won't, and maybe an advisory, whatever, right? And maybe you said it, and if you did, I'm sorry, I missed it. I had to step out for about 15 minutes. But when it comes to, and like you said, you be very careful about when it comes to board members, because they're difficult to get rid of, right? My question for you is, if someone says, hey, I've got, you know, X amount of money, but I've got 5X of trouble that's coming with me, how do you balance that? And is there like an interview process? Is there a list of questions that we could ask? Do we want to do a background on these people? I mean, how do we make sure that we're not, even though they're bringing in some money, we're not getting more problems than the money's worth? Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah, it does. And I bet you if there's 10 groups you're talking about, there's probably 10 answers to answer that. It probably really depends. I mean, the first thing is, are you taking the right money? You know, we all know in the startup world, when people start engaging with investors and it's hard, it takes a lot of engagement. and you finally find someone, you're like, how do I keep this going and make sure that we can make this happen? But you also have to consider the things you're saying. If you have a lot of choices, then, more power to you to really be specific on, let's talk about how our board works and what we're looking for, what the culture of our company is, and who you're thinking of putting on our board. I mean, I know in reality that there's going to be certain investors that are just going to put people on your board. I mean, it's just how it's going to be. But I know there's other ones that are really wonderful. I mean, like Moneta and stuff, where I'm sure there's like a conversation of, here's what we're looking for. Who were you thinking? And I think the dialogue alone, Scott, is going to be really healthy, because the fact that they see that you're even looking at that and wanting to make sure that you get somebody that's going to enjoy what you're doing as well as be a productive member. I think you're just going to have to talk through it and see. And if, I mean, so I come a lot now from the public director world, and there's activists, investors that impose themselves on the board. It's not a fun, I haven't had that yet, but many of my peers have, and there's no choice there. So I think you're in a place of choice. It's who's going to invest and how's that going to look. So I don't have a quick answer for you. I really don't.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to getting those slides, because I missed some of them. So thank you.
I mean, and just being open to looking at it and all that is great, because I think a lot of people, when they get to that point, are just so happy to have the investment that they aren't thinking of that. And so the fact that you're thinking of it and can look through it, and hopefully you have a couple different people that you can make choices between.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So I think we had one last question, if we have the time. Kim, was just any ideas on getting started on serving on boards? If there's any ideas on kind of like where to maybe start that process.
You mean other than the question?
To be a board member.
You mean other than early stage? Is that what because I think I already answered that a little bit. We talked about 1 million cups.
Got it. I think that might have been trying to find board members, but I think it similarly goes on the other hand. If you're looking for
how to find the board members, how to find the board members. Is that what you're saying?
I think that was a question earlier, but I
gotcha.
think it's a similar process.
Well, no, because wanting to be on a board and kind of looking at it versus finding where you go to find board members. Okay, so my experience on smaller early stage companies is it's a bit organic. It's not like you don't go out to LinkedIn, you don't go like a shotgun approach. You just don't. It's way too coveted to even on a small company. If you have someone already involved in your company that's a CEO or a partner or advisor, then I would have a discussion on, we know we're getting ready to add another board member. What do we need? What are we looking for? And then use your networks. And maybe your network's not big enough. I always tell people you got to network for whatever you're doing, but don't network when you need it. Network way before you need it. So if you're already a founder now or CEO or whatever and on board, and even a year from now or two or whatever, you should be already trying to reach out and see what you can find. Now that reaching out and networking obviously can happen on LinkedIn, but it can also happen. And we have a wonderful ecosystem here in the region I network like crazy. That's practically all I do these days. I network to look for board opportunities that might be of interest by going to groups that are putting on programs about being a good board director. But that's a little bit beyond the startup environment, not necessarily, but I do think there's a lot of things in our ecosystem that bring us all together. And I would network in those ecosystems. The other thing I would do is meet with other founders and other CEOs and find out how they went about looking for directors for their board. Obviously, if someone's willing to make a decent investment, that's something you should consider. If you look for people in those early stages that have done what you've done and you're looking for them to invest, they'd be a natural if they would be willing, but a lot of times they don't want to take the time to do that. So that could happen or it could not. So I don't think there's just one path. I think it's going to require collaboration, networking, reaching out, calling Cameron, finding out, who's out there, looking for people that might be potential investors that maybe they've been in the, if it's a medical device or something, maybe they've been involved. It's a pretty big deal to ask somebody to be on a board. I mean, it's not an easy process. It's not going to be someone you don't know at all. Even on the boards that I serve on, publicly traded boards, there's always a connection to somebody that somebody knows and can vet that person. Even if we go through channels and find someone that we don't know that well, there's always going to be some way that person is vetted. So you're going to want to vet the person. You would never want to put somebody, if there's somebody you're considering for your board that might be interested, I suggest you get to know them very well before you ever make that happen. Make sure it's just not someone, oh, they used to be X, Y, and Z, they'd be good on my board. It has to be somebody that you've gotten to know, that you think you can work with and get along with, because it'll go on for a while, hopefully.
Definitely. Yeah, as I kind of just conclude here, I think another great thing is just looking at programs. So say like Fourth Wave or the Growth Factory, they have, great networks that can help you identify that person along that process.
That's true. All those incubator programs come with all kinds of advisors and those advisors, a lot of times that people say, have someone start advising, then decide then they will know what's going on and you will get to know them better. And that's another really great path to getting somebody to consider somebody for your board.
Love it. Well, thank you, Kim, for leading the charge here this afternoon and tackling this first workshop on the board overview. We will be hosting our second workshop on March 20th, which is a Monday from 1 to 2 p.m. here with the same Zoom link. And that will be on board mechanics. So we'll be diving into, how to build out your board calendar, who should attend board meetings, how to put together communications, and ultimately continue to engage and get the most value out of your board. So we appreciate you all being here in the space. We will follow up with the recording as well as the slides for you to run through. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. The email will be coming from me, so feel free to respond to that. But thank you again, Kim, and thank you all for being in the space. And we look forward to seeing you about the ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Your Monday.
Really, really great. See you in a couple weeks.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.